In 1862, there'd been only a few thousand people living in Washington, D.C., and most of them would go elsewhere for the summer. And there was a theater at the resort in Long Branch where the Lincolns and the Grants enjoyed attending. And Long Branch was a beach resort town that McKinley also liked to visit, and they would all escape the sweltering heat of Washington, D.C. by riding the Long Branch of the B&O Railroad up to the Jersey Shore, so it was called the summer capital. Long Branch was 40 miles south of New York and 60 miles away from Philadelphia. And Edwin Booth bought the Walnut Theater in Philadelphia in 1863 and became the manager of the Winter Garden Theater in New York City that year. And Edwin Booth traveled from theater to theater and may very well have been doing theater business in Long Branch on the Jersey Shore when Robert Lincoln stumbled into the train and almost died from falling between the moving train and the platform. Robert Lincoln had recognized Edwin Booth as his rescuer, and Robert Lincoln had told General Grant about it, and General Grant had sent a thank you note to Edwin Booth for saving Robert Lincoln. And riding to the end of the line in Jersey City had been high entertainment for young people. One of John Hay's jobs had been to escort Mary and the children when they would take the train to the Jersey Shore to visit the resort theater in Long Beach, and they would ride the train leaving the 6th Street station where President Garfield would be assassinated in 1881 in the presence of Robert Lincoln, 15 years after the death of his father. And when Abraham Lincoln had been carried across the street to his deathbed, his 21-year-old son Robert had immediately been brought to his bedside while Garfield continued on his way to New York on the train. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, fondly called the B&O, had been the first to install the telegraph along its right-of-way in 1843, and it had been over that line that the Whig Party's announcement of their nomination for president had been sent from Baltimore to Washington, D.C. on the 1st of May, in 1844, followed 3 weeks later at the official opening of the B&O line, with Samuel Morse sending "What Hath God Wrought" on the 24th of May. The only railroad bridge between the North and the South had been at Harper's Ferry, and it was owned by the B&O, and the South blew up the Harper's Ferry Bridge on the 14th of June in 1861, and that first year of the war between the states had begun with blowing up bridges and destroying tracks and tearing down telegraph lines. Andrew Carnegie built a railroad line bypassing hostile Baltimore that would save the Union, and Carnegie was an immigrant from Scotland who would build thousands of libraries after the war. The new President Johnson did not like the military and did his best to limit its power in the South, and so Johnson was brought up on charges via impeachment, but many thought it was because he was drinking too much. Congress balked at the final vote, so Johnson stayed in the Oval Office for another year, and the real reason they'd not removed Johnson from office was that the next in line was a man who wanted to give women the right to vote. At the next election, General Grant was put into the presidency, and when he became president in 1868, Grant refused to ride to the inauguration in the same carriage with Johnson, and Johnson refused to go to Grant's inauguration at all. Surrattsville would be renamed the town of Clinton, and Secretary Seward would take a trip on the new Transcontinental Railroad in 1869 and would meet with Brigham Young in Salt Lake City, who had worked as a carpenter on the Seward House back in the day. And from the West Coast, Seward sailed to Alaska to survey the new American territory he'd just bought from the Tsar of Russia in 1867. When Seward returned to Washington, D.C., he gave official notice that the Mormons were finding success in their endeavor to grow cotton in Utah, in a town they were calling Washington City. So from that time forward, Seward said that people needed to stop using the name Washington City in favor of the name Washington, D.C., and it would take until 1877 for all federal troops in the South to be withdrawn, just 12 years following all the carnage. Because he had surrendered without keeping the war going throughout the summer, The Confederate President Davis had been released from jail in only 2 years, with very few others spending any time in prison. None were executed, and very little property was confiscated, although many of the last names of the people who had died for the South completely disappeared in America, many of them of French extraction. With all the sacrifice made in the war between the states, all the South really lost was their slaves, most of whom stayed to work for their old bosses, and the plantation owners were now too poor to hire workers, so they survived by selling off small parts of their land to independent farmers who began sharecropping, mostly cotton and tobacco, since they were cash crops. Sharecropping was just like the old days, except that the owners quit being considerate towards their American workers of African descent, because they were no longer the owner's personal property, and after 7 years, Congress passed the Amnesty Act that allowed all former Confederates to vote again, although a few hundred of them were barred from holding public office, and things soon enough went back to normal in the South, with people just staying home with their juleps and laudanum. Many Southerners were poor losers, and quite a few became outlaws and bandits like Jesse James, who would be killed by one of his friends for the reward money, and the Ku Klux Klan emerged as a militia to bring order and safety amidst the chaos. Having had enough of the East and the South and the North, Fremont went decisively west, and Douglas MacArthur's father would restore Fremont's pension in 1890 to the tune of $2,000 a year.